and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question. Why? Maybe it sounds like a simple question. Maybe it sounds like the trickiest question ever. But this is what is on the mind of our conversation partner today. And so it's something that I've been thinking about as well. Today, we are diving into part one of our conversation with Kaya Hill. Kaya is a friend of mine that I went to school with. We both studied communication. And I just think she has some really great ideas, things to say, and great perspective. This episode is special too because we're trying something different here. And that is starting with the question of what's Kaya's idea of a better social world and letting the rest of the conversation emerge from there. And for me, this is all in an attempt to continue to try to embody better this communication perspective that I want to adopt of what are we creating in our communication, and if we really trust emergence and giving our conversations the space to breathe, what can emerge from them when they're not over scripted. So anyway, I'm really happy with how this conversation turned out, and I hope you'll enjoy it and find some meaning in it as well. I'm sure you will. So you'll understand in a moment why our question is why today. So let's just jump right in with Kaya. Hi, Kaya. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, how are you? So good to see you, talk to you.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because, as you know, we're trying something new today, and I'm glad that you're my buddy to get to experiment with, because anyone who's listened to my other episodes will know that I want to end the conversation with, what's your idea of a better social world? And that comes out of the language of CMM, and I kind of have used that as like a recap of the conversation. But recently I was having a conversation with my dad, actually, and our conversation is what led to me thinking about trying to flip this and say, let's start with the question, what's your idea of a better social world? And let the rest of the conversation emerge from there, which is not my preferred way to do podcasts, or it's not how I've been doing them. I like to be a little more prepared than I am for today. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little anxious, but I'm trusting you as my conversation partner and trusting that whatever's going to come out of this conversation is going to be meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great way to kick something off. Like, it's out of your comfort zone, but you open the door to a world of possibilities by just asking this one question. So I was really intrigued by the question itself, and I think it's a great topic to start anything off with, let alone a podcast.
Yeah, so, and that's what I'm like. I could start every podcast episode with this question and have 100 different conversations, because everyone's going to have something different to say and different experiences that have led them to have that beliefs. But that being said, Kaya, before we do jump into it, could you introduce yourself a little bit? Share some things and stories about you that you feel like are important to know about you as we go into this conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My name is Kaya Hill. I graduated from Ball State University in 2022. Yes. Last December. I studied communication. Interpersonal communication, to be exact. And as I was going through that, I actually, shout out to Mary Moore, if you're listening. She got me through college single-handedly, kept me in school. I stood up on the first day of one of her classes, like my freshman year, when we were introducing ourselves. I said, my name is Kaya Hill, and I don't know what I'm doing here, because I didn't want to be in college. It was not my go-to. It was not my path, I didn't think at the time. I was on track to go out to LA and just dance and not really be in school or pursue a degree in any form or fashion. And then I ended up at Ball State. I thought, let me try to secure a future and not go out on a whim. I was in a very compromised position going into my freshman year of college with a lack of familial support and financially, and was going through a lot of things. So I thought I should, secure my future instead. And so there I was, showed up to class, stood up, said, I don't know what I'm doing here. Mary looked at me in the eye. She said, come talk to me after class, come up to my office. And so I did. And the rest is history. I graduated early, and I loved every second that I spent in the Ball State Comm department. And along the way, I picked up a couple of minors, one in African American studies and another one in history. And I'd always had this kind of urge to learn more about history growing up. remember my junior year of high school, I took APUSH, or American, history, but like the
Yeah, yeah,
advanced
yeah.
AP. And I just always was left wanting more. And then I went back and I thought, well, what did I want more of? It was more stories of people who are underrepresented, people who aren't talked about. I was like, there has to be more to the civil rights movement than Martin Luther King. There has to be more to the Underground Railroad than, Sojourner Truth. Like there just has to be more. And so that's what I really sought to get out of my college experience, was that more. And I absolutely did. And so I think that's probably the most central part of who I am and who we are just as young adults, going to school in 2020, being in college during that time, which of course was the pandemic, but was also a super racially intense just moment in American history. And I think that was really eye-opening for me to be at such and have economic kind of vulnerability, but also racial vulnerability. I don't even know if you remember, but campus was shut down for a while. It was hard. It was very dangerous to walk around. There were alerts going out to people of color on campus, like if you are going to go out at night, you should not walk alone. And this is 2020. Yeah. Like we think we're so far removed from the horror and violence of the 60s and before that, but we are not to this day. So I think that's just super important. And that's something I keep at the front of my mind, is that we are not so far removed from that history as we think we are. And the more we dive into it, the better off we are. The more we understand where we come from, the better we can build our future. And so that kind of goes into your question, building a better social world. I think I set that up.
I was just going to say, I'm pretty sure you're already answering the question, but get into that, Kyle. What is it that you see a better social world as being?
Honest. I think I think a better social world is an honestly social world. And I'm not talking in terms of like, just like telling everybody how it is, the way it is. It's not that. We need to remedy our dishonesty. We have been dishonest as a people for years, out of convenience, out of safety, out of protecting ourselves, protecting our history, protecting whatever it is we think is America or American or even just worldly. We have done so much to protect that. And a lot of that comes from lies and dishonesty and hiding things. And I truly don't think that we can advance to the best point of our society without acknowledging the things that we've done and where we've come from. I would say that 100%, we just need to be more honest and dive into the history. I think that's where it starts, is to the history. And that's how we begin to be more honest with ourselves, more honest with our history, is learning the things we don't know and really asking the question, why? Questioning everything. I think is super, super important and an important step in that. And it's like, there's so many things that we've been told our whole lives that we kind of just accept. Like we don't take the second, and it's natural. It's human nature. And I think that's also important to remember, is that it's not malicious. Not always. There at points there it was malicious. So you look at the Reagan administration and how they changed the way we go about public education in general, how that was kind of the gatekeeping of education when that began in the 70s. When Reagan moved to make secondary educations and higher ed not free anymore. And that was directly following the integration of America, directly following the Civil Rights Act. And it was a deliberate attempt to keep certain information out of certain people's hands. And that's the kind of dishonesty I'm talking about, is that when you know that, you have to take into account that is what we did as a country. That is the direction we moved. And there are so many implications of that today.
Well, we're only 5 minutes in. You're already blowing my mind. So I'm feeling great about this conversation. But like, you saying that we've been dishonest with ourselves, like that, I haven't maybe thought of that as the framework of honesty, dishonesty, but it immediately makes sense to me. Like you saying it's 2020 and we're going around pretending like all of these issues don't exist. That's us being dishonest with ourselves to, I don't know, like you said, protect some ego or some precious image that we have of what this country is and means and represents and blah, 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 and progress. So that immediately rings true to me. I'm curious just because I've never thought about it in that kind of framework of like, there's the need for honesty to repair the dishonesty. Do you remember like what sparked you to think about things in the framework of honesty and dishonesty?
It was during college. It was when I was really diving into the civil rights movement and what it was. It was AFAM 100, African American Studies, intro to the course. And in that course, you kind of trace just everything throughout history, where we started and where we went to and where we are now. And I think that when I was really looking into MLK and Malcolm X and how we historically have posed them as opposing, views, how they were vastly different, how MLK was accepted by society where Malcolm X wasn't. And that was my first inclination to the why. Why is it painted like this? Why do we talk about these people this way? Why do we not learn about Malcolm X in the way that we learn about MLK? And you start to dive into that. And when you learn that MLK was closer to Malcolm X's beliefs by the end of his life than in Malcolm X, they had almost switched ideologies toward the end of the life. And yet we still don't talk about Malcolm X. We don't talk about that shift. I think that was when I was like, okay, we're not being honest. Because if we think about it, MLK, still a Black man, right? And he was still a Black man in the 60s. There's absolutely no way that the way that we portrayed him as accepted by all was accurate.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no way. And you look at Malcolm X and you see that his powerful words and his influence was widespread. We don't talk about him. And you think, well, why don't we talk about him? And you look in and you find out how many followers this guy had, how many people looked up to him.
Yeah.
And then you start to think, oh, we have not been honest, right? And then you even think about their approaches to civil rights, to civil justice, right? And you think about the nonviolence approach. Well, of course, we're going to lift up the nonviolent approach because violence against a certain demographic is damnable to hell, but violence against another is encouraged. So they want the people that they have oppressed for years to be nonviolent, right? We paint it as that is the best way to approach civil justice, right? Is to be nonviolent. Mm-hmm. They know that's not true. We should know that's not true. After 400 years of basically doing so and seeing not much honest advancement come from it, we should realize that that is absolutely a tactic of the people who are in power, is to paint things in certain ways and to kind of bend truths. And then you go further and you find that MLK is highly, speculated to have been alive when he made it to the hospital and killed in the hospital. And then you learn about things like, I don't know, like the prison system. And you learn about how that has come to be what it is. And then you just keep learning, you keep diving, you keep going back further and further. And you realize that like there has been a missing piece to every story we've learned about Black history specifically. And I'm going to talk about Black history. Your listeners don't see me, but I'm a very Black female, and I'm going to talk about Black history because that's what's closest to me. But of course, you go back and you look at any history of a marginalized or oppressed group, and there's similar themes. I'm also gay, and you go back and we don't even talk about gay people throughout history. We don't talk about sexuality throughout history. And then you learn that Eleanor Roosevelt was a little bit fruity, and it changes your whole perspective on everything. And it's so true. She had these letters that were very intimate with another woman, and her husband knew about it. And he was just like, just keep it under wraps. We've always not like, there have always been these things, but we don't talk about them. And it's a very much a tactic that is implemented in order to keep people complacent. And it's very dishonest. It is very dishonest.
Yeah. The idea that you're making me think of is from our communication classes. And I talk about it all the time because it just really resonated with me. The difference between the idea that there is one capital T truth that is out there that we're supposed to find versus the idea of pluralistic truths, that there's a bunch of little t truths that can coexist at the same time. And we're kind of like creating those truths for ourselves instead of like they're somewhere out there we need to find. And that's what I kind of hear you saying about like the stories we've been told about history has been, I don't know, we've acted like there is this capital T truth version of history. And that's what's been approved for mass consumption so that we all kind of understand history in this one-dimensional way. Whereas the reality of it is that there are many little t truths. And that's in terms of history, that's to say that there's more to the story, and there are a million stories of one thing that happened and a million little nuances that are important to understand. And there's not a lot of that asking why in every space. Not to say that there's no asking why going on in any school or in any, group of people. But I think it's like, I don't know, not a skill that's taught, and people get scared of it, which I understand because it's like, if you start questioning everything, it's like you don't have any solid ground to stand on. Like that feels really, I don't know, unnerving or frightening. But to me, I'm like, that's what we need. We need to scrap the whole system. And so the ground you're standing on, you do need to pick it up, rip it up, pick up the pieces and question it, even if that's going to be uncomfortable. But I think it's a skill that people just like haven't learned.
I would 100% agree. I also think it's not encouraged, at a young enough age. I have little brothers, and the most annoying thing that they can do when they're little is ask why.
Yeah.
And it's a societal standing. It's the way we feel so threatened by that question often. It's like you said, like we're like questioning anything, it can be like, what do you stand on? And it's like being questioned, you're questioning what I stand on, right? And so when someone's asking why, it starts to feel like a personal attack.
Yeah.
But that's also just the way we situated ourselves. And I've only ever lived in America, so I can only speak for American attitudes. It might be different in other places in the world, but 100% here, like if you're a kid in a classroom and you're asking why, your teacher's likely going to get fed up with you. And that's unfortunate. That's really unfortunate, because a curious kid, all kids should be encouraged to be curious. They should all be encouraged to be curious. And people want to talk about indoctrination now. And while, like throughout your schooling as a young adult or even as a child, right? We don't think of the things that they're teaching us as indoctrination, right? We don't think that we're being taught certain things for certain reasons to believe certain ways, but we are. And I mean, and it's not, again, it's not necessarily malicious in every way, but when you are not encouraged to question the things you're being taught, you are being indoctrinated with those beliefs and ideas. So that is where I think a lot of the kind of apprehension toward a lot of the things that are going on right now in education, a lot of the wanting more out of education, wanting more out of Black history, wanting to study more of these things, that's where that apprehension comes from. It's because, that why is threatening to them. It's threatening to a lot of people. And I don't think it should be, but it's also like when you get to college and you start asking why, it's great, but it also feels a little bit too late, because that why is also, it's under the weight of despair. Yeah. It's like, it's no longer a curious why. It is a frustrated why. It is a why the hell, why the, it's that. Whereas when it's a kid, it's a curious why. And you can build on that understanding, and then you can act on it when you're in college. But when you start at 20, 21 years old asking that why, it's almost like you've already lost all hope. So it's very strategic. Again, it's very, very strategic. It's a way to keep people from asking those questions, I think. I'm a little bit cynical too, but I'm very much, F the system, whatever, all that good stuff. So I think everything's like intentional in a way. You said something that reminded me of something that's going on in Florida. Oh, truths, capital T, big truth, little t truth. I don't know if you heard, but just recently in Florida, they added to the standards that slaves benefited from slavery.
That's wild.
Gained skills. It is. It's insane. And not because slaves didn't gain skills. Number one, there's so many things. There's so many things that are happening with this. Number one, you brought slaves over to do the work for you, right? So they likely already had the skills you're talking about if you're going out and outsourcing that labor. And they did. Africa was thriving before colonization. It was rich, it was happy, it was thriving before colonization. Then so you have that aspect. And then you also have the aspect that, well, when you bring someone over and you hold them in captivity, they're going into survival mode. And survival mode is going to teach you skills that are likely going to benefit you later in life. Whether, it's an unfortunate thing, it's really unfortunate, but it's, again, natural. It's human nature. So you're not wrong in saying that slaves gained skills. What you're wrong in doing is teaching that as a capital T truth, and not a well-rounded story of what slavery entailed. And it's wild to me. It is wild to me, especially in Florida, especially right now with everything that they're doing, backtracking on so many African American history courses, so many topics and subjects that need to be talked about. And yet they implement this new thing where we're talking about slaves benefiting from slavery. And it's a very telltale sign of the direction that we're headed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the problem with that is you can say that, but the undertone that I'm sensing is that they're trying to say that as an excuse to make slavery not sound as bad as it was. And that's certainly not okay.
Not at all.
The thing that you were making me think of is when I also started asking why for the first time, because for me, I feel like it's really clear. Like I can point to my freshman year of college and say before that, I had a very like simple understanding of the world to kind of like right, wrong, good, bad, and that kind of dichotomy. And then I got to college and I experienced different things that I was like, I don't know how to fit my world into this right and wrong category anymore. I'm sensing there's some like gray area. And I feel like since then, that's really been my kind of path of like coloring in that, I don't know, gray in between to try to understand more of the nuances of the world. Because I was like, this old way of understanding that I had, it just doesn't hold up anymore. And so I have to look a little closer at the things I thought I knew. And like you're saying, it's frustrating because for me, it was like a frustration of like, why didn't anyone teach me these skills earlier? It's so clear to me that the world is not that simple and that there are many little T truth stories, like out there. There's so many stories that coexist together. And like, why weren't those skills taught to me? Why am I having to figure this out now? And you kind of alluded to that, but I was wondering if, that was similar for you, if it was like going to college when you really remember first starting to ask why, or if there was maybe seeds of that even earlier for you.
I honestly, there weren't seeds of it earlier. So when I was growing up, I grew up middle class, fairly, not well off, but didn't have to worry per se, right? So I wasn't coming home from school and worrying if there was going to be dinner that night, at least not my whole life. We, of course, had our struggles. We all went through recession. There were those hardships, but for the most part, we were pretty stable. I went to a very predominantly white school, and I was surrounded by white people most of my life. Most of all of my closest friends were white, and it made it a lot easier to just accept the things that we were being taught because I didn't have any other perspectives. I also grew up in a very, very Christian and Republican household. So it was also that implemented. So my kind of situation really set me up to believe in the things that they were teaching us, to not ask why. My mom hated that question. So I didn't ask it, right? I was not that person. But again, like it wasn't until I started to get into African American studies. And I mean, there was a semblance of it, right? When I was in APUSH, when I was in, my history classes, and we spent, I think, 3 weeks on the New Deal, and about 2 hours total on the civil rights movement. That was probably my first what the F moment. Why are we spending so much time on one piece of legislation, on one thing, and we are spending a total of, I would say, 2 hours total on the civil rights movement. So that's like 2 class periods.
Yeah.
And then maybe in total throughout the course, probably a week's worth of Black history in there. And the way they teach it was just that's when it started to kind of like be like, that's when I was like, why? What are we doing? What are we teaching? Why are we teaching it this way? Because I don't know when the last time you took history class was, or like if you think back to high school history and you think of the way it's set up and how they do it, like by like certain groups of years, right? So you'll have the Columbus came to America. You have that era. And then a little bit later, a Revolutionary War. And then a little bit later, there was, this and that, French and Indian War. Then there was a couple things. Oh yeah, slavery. That was a thing. 1860s though, it's gone. That's the mention. That is Black history from 1619 to 1860, according to most American history classes, at least the one I took, right? One's in Indiana. Again, I will never try to speak for anyone else's experience. I can only speak out of my schools. In my school in Indiana, that's the way they taught it. I know a lot of people have similar experiences. 1619 was the first slave ship that arrived. And then up until 1860, the most mention that there is, oh yeah, slavery was a thing, but we abolished it in 1860. Lincoln did, right? And then talk about Reconstruction a little bit, just a little bit, and we say that's about repairing the South. We don't talk about the violence, the lynching, the pushback. We don't talk about that. And then we talk about Andrew Jackson and the Native Americans and the Trail of Tears and the atrocity that is. And then things happen, this and that and this. Oh, the 20s, we love the 20s. And then we get to the 60s. Oh yeah, civil rights movement, Black people get rights. And then that's it. Again, another 100 years of history that's just skimmed over. And then after that, we don't really talk about Black people again. I'm sure now in the history classes, there's a mention of 2020 and the BLM movements that happened. But I'm sure there's still not a extensive and cohesive history of the prison system and what it's evolved into. Mm-hmm. There's not. That is, I think, one of the eeriest things that I kind of took on and kind of realized while learning about African American history was that we talk about it in chunks, and that there is so much that happens in between those times. Like at every point where there's a like step forward in Black rights or just like the smallest advancement, there's another thing that's enacted that sends you 10 steps back. Mm-hmm. You know, Black codes, Reconstruction violence, the prison systems, the war on drugs, economic disparity, just like it's constant, but they don't teach it as a constant thing. They teach it as, sporadically. Mm-hmm. We remember that Black people have not been treated the same, but we don't talk about it extensively. And I think that was definitely something that I remember having that epiphany in African American studies, the intro class, where I was like, wait. So you're telling me that this whole time we've been learning about Black history, there was actually other stuff going on mm-hmm. in Black history in these times where we're not talking about it? Like, it seems so juvenile to not put that together, but they do a very good job of not being honest, of not opening the opportunity for you to ask why or ask what's going on. They fill it with so much other things that you're like, oh, that's a lot of history. Yeah, that makes sense. Everything's happening, blah, 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 blah. But there's so many missing pieces to the puzzle. And that was absolutely an eye-opener for me, was to learn about all of the things that weren't told in the times in between these, fights for justice, these fights for rights.
Oh my God, yeah. It's like, yes, there is one way to talk history that is bullet points of this war mm-hmm. happened, this legislation passed, this person said this thing, this was a big deal, whatever. Those are kind of what we focus on in like a history class setting, where what's more compelling to me, and I think should be the focus of conversations about history, is like, what are the actual people's stories who lived this? Because it's like, if I don't mm-hmm. see my life as bullet points and facts, fun facts. It's like there's real like emotion behind the things that are happening, and it helps you understand like the day-to-day struggles of people and how those bigger bullet points did affect people's daily lives. Mm-hmm. And yeah, like you said, the focus isn't on that. And so you're not really taught, or maybe just even like given the space to like look around for those stories at all.
And I think it's interesting. So what you said made me think of what we're told in history classes, like growing up, and you're given these events, and a lot of times test time comes around, they're like, you don't need to know names or dates or anything. And I'm like, when you grow up and you realize that names and dates are the most important parts of history, mm-hmm. Who's telling the story is central to what the history is, because history is in the eye of the beholder. We can witness the same event, but our standpoint, our experiences, our life leading up to that point is going to make us see that event completely differently. Mm-hmm. So it absolutely matters. I mean, it's like at some point in history, classes down the road, there'll be a quote, and it'll be, anyone who burns down a grocery store in their own neighborhood is a thug and a criminal. It's like, you don't need to know the names and dates, let alone that was our president. Mm-hmm. That is who said that the name is important. It's 100% important. And no matter what way you take that comment, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, knowing who said it is going to impact it. It's like those
and
videos.
The context of it matters.
Absolutely. Exactly.
That's what you miss when you don't pay attention to those stories. Because you can say slavery was ended, and we're like, great, sounds good. But until you look at the reality of it and the way people's lives were actually affected at that time, that is what gives you maybe some of that motivation for pause and to ask some more questions.
And I think it's even interesting there because growing up in school, you remember hearing slavery ended, but we don't remember hearing about any celebrations, any, you know, happy anything ending of slavery. And we don't even have the cognizance at that age to be like, well, why are we not learning about anyone being happy? Why is there no cheer? Why is there no joy? And then when you grow up and there's two reasons. It's first you think, okay, well, they just don't want us to know about it. Like they just didn't want to teach us about the joy. But then you get older and you're like, there wasn't joy. There wasn't that relief yet. Right. There were people who didn't know until years later. Right. So there were still slavery was still going on after that point. So it's like you have to be in the position to even think to ask why. And I think that's something that our education programs have done such a good job of, is erasing that even disposition to ask why. They disconnect the dots so heavily that we're not even in the place to even think that there's a dot to connect. And I think that is so dangerous. So like circling back to that better social world and, you know, connecting those dots, it takes at the point we are in a society right now. I don't think that, I mean, unless every parent, you know, or every soon to be parent, wannabe parent comes together and says, this is the way we're going to, you know, teach our kids. It's not going to happen unless the people in charge start being honest about the things that they left out. And they're not going to do that unless people are holding them accountable too. So it's just a whole thing, which is why I say honesty is the only way to a better social world, right? Because you even have like these beliefs of the Holocaust. And when you learn that, you know, Hitler based a lot of his strategies, a lot of the things he did off of American slavery, it completely changes the way you approach that conversation. It changes everything. But we don't even, you know, have the cognizance to put together that slavery and those things occurred in a time where Hitler would be able to draw from that. Like, you know, like we don't think that. We don't think about the fact that MLK and Anne Frank, they were born around the same time, right? Like we don't have that connection. And because of the dishonesty and the way that we have gatekept certain aspects of history, the way that we have isolated, the way we have isolated certain events throughout history.
That's what I was going to say. That points us back to the context again of like knowing the different stories that are happening at the same time as each other is so important to understand the meaning, like what those events actually meant in their context, instead of just, isolating them, airlifting them out of the context and kind of presenting them on their own as if they did exist in isolation. And I think what I'm hearing you saying too is that, yes, a better social world is an honest one. It's also a curious one. And I'm thinking back to your brothers, and I'm like, your brothers are, you know, I can know immediately what you're talking about when you say adults are not encouraging question asking in young children who are going, why? And I can understand that would be annoying. But if you think about like every time your child or, you know, a kid asks you why, and you say because, or you say stop asking, you know, every time you shut that down, that adds up enough to teach children who become adults that they don't get to ask why, or that they shouldn't be asking why. And I think that's probably part of the interesting conversation right now that you were starting to talk about, is like, you and I can look back on our shit and be like, okay, that was pretty messed up. Let me try to remedy this for myself right now. Let me start asking those questions. But it's like, what could happen if the people who are children right now, what if that curiosity is fostered? What kind of adults could they grow into? And what kind of social world would they be able to imagine if they had the tool of curiosity and if they could confidently use it because they hadn't been shut down their whole life from being curious?
I think the question is, what couldn't it do? If we're curious as a people, I mean, they say the curiosity killed the cat, right? But the cat still got to do something with, like, they still went and got the thrill of being curious. Like, so what if it's not the safe the safe path, because that's the illusion that it creates, is that not asking why is safer. But when my little brothers don't ask why they're treated differently, when they don't understand why they're treated differently, they're in 10 times more danger, right?
Yes.
So it's like curiosity killed the cat, but so does complacency, right?
Yeah.
So does not going after something. You're gonna die anyway. You might as well, get answers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think constantly about my little brothers and how in the house that they grow up in, they're not going to be given a talk on how they need to behave or act in the presence of, certain figures of authority. They're not going to get that because, the people that they're growing up around don't believe that they need to. And that's to each their own. Parents, can go about that in whatever way they want to, sure. But you are putting them in so much more danger, in my opinion, with them not understanding that, with not even recognizing that they should ask, right? And so that's why I think, curiosity can only open doors. It can only, it can only prove to be better for everyone, to just continue to be curious, to continue, because even if you don't get the answers right away, you are putting people in this position to either be honest or to not, right? And if we're not continually holding people accountable by asking that why, challenging them, questioning them, that's where we become complacent, right?
Yeah.
That's where we just start to accept what we're told. Like, there's absolutely no reason it should be normal, and we should just be okay with like working up until 65 years of age when the life expectancy is 77 years right now. That's crazy. You start asking those questions. You start asking that why. Why is this the way it is? Why are we just okay with this? It only opens doors to not even just like completely eradicate the way we do things, but to mend things, to adjust things, to have conversations about these things, and to make it better for generations to come, right? And so it's not like it's got to be eliminate the work system. Nobody works ever, which that'd be great too. Like, great, awesome. Yeah. Don't have to work. That's awesome. But we could also think, okay, why do we work 9 to 5, 5 days a week? Why not work 2 days a week and, maybe put in an extra hour? Or why do we have to be there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? Why is there a weekend? Why does Saturday and Sunday exist? And why are we off Saturday and Sunday versus Monday and Tuesday? It can only open doors for conversation. And I get that eventually at a point, it could just be, well, why does the sun come up in the morning? Why this? Then you get to like the goofy, corny, like, sure, you can ask those questions, but those are things that are not within our control. When it comes to questioning a system, when it comes to questioning a way of life, it's the only way to advance. I think when we stop asking why, we stop pushing to be better, and we start to just accept things for what they are. And I don't think we should ever just accept things for what they are, especially when we're in the greatest country in the world, right? If we're just going to accept things the way we are, we can't simultaneously accept things how they are and continue to be the greatest country in the world. That cannot coexist. So you have to question it. You have to ask why if you want to advance.
Yeah. To me, it sounds like the asking why, looking back and reflecting and asking why, and also then following that up with, what could be different, what could be next, is really telling, I think, about what society values. And so I'm just hanging on it's a silly phrase, but it does feel like emblematic of this conversation of the like curiosity killed the cat, where it's like, if that is what you believe, then what I think is beyond just the surface level of that expression is like, almost like, don't be too curious or you're going to learn something you don't want to, or you didn't want to know. And I think what that's saying it values is we value keeping things the way they are. And we value staying in a comfortable zone where none of us have to like feel bad about where the cat doesn't have to die, to use the analogy more. But it's like, and not to get too morbid, but like, I don't know, maybe the cat needs to die, if the cat is the way things are, and so it's like, do you value maintaining some kind of status quo or some kind of false idea of peace that exists? Or do you value, what I would say is like real progress and real evolution and leaves room for that kind of curiosity and that kind of reflection that allows you to look back and move forward and try to be better. We can't even get to the conversation of what is a better social world if we're not actually trying to be better, because we're so busy trying to keep things the same, not for any really good reason other than it's what we know and we're scared of the unknown.
Yeah.
Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Kaya. I think a great next turn is to be considering the question that I posed at the beginning of the episode, which is why? And also I'd have you be thinking about, what do you think you know about history, whether it is your own personal history, family histories, your community's history, your country's history, the world's history. What do you think you know, and where can you be asking why, and where can you be looking for more stories that maybe have not been told? Like Kaya and I talked about today, our histories are really rich and full of personal stories and experiences and feelings and emotions. And that's not often the version of the story that we get told. So it feels important to be seeking out those stories where we can. And like Kaya and I kind of ended on this idea of curiosity killing the cat. Just how can you be curious? And just because that's a saying that people say, does that mean that it's true? And does that mean that that has to be something that we live by? I like this idea, and it's one I'm going to keep thinking about, and we'll kind of pick back up with it in part 2, which will come out next week. And I hope you'll join us back for that. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives, all designed with the idea of creating better social worlds and making the tools, language, and ideas of a communication perspective more accessible to people. I'm so grateful to have their support and to be able to collaborate with them in the creation of this podcast. Finally, the podcast next turns I want to offer you are, of course, to share this episode with someone that you think would find it meaningful. And if you have any thoughts, ideas, questions, feelings, I'm happy to be in conversation with you if you want to reach out to me in one of the many places you can do that, which you can find in the description. So thank you for showing up today. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.